and acknowledge that sovereignty of this land has never been ceded. We are on stolen land. There is still so much to do in terms of justice for our First Nations Victorians. And we're about to embark on a treaty process here in Victoria, which is incredibly exciting. I met with the First Peoples Assembly and the Treaty Authority a couple of weeks ago, and the Treaty Authority just launched their first step really in the treaty process, a database where different organisations can nominate to enter into treaty negotiations with the state. That was a really significant moment. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about treaty over the next few months and years, and the Greens will be doing some forums to explain what treaty is and what it means and how it actually functions as well. So look out for those. I'd like to invite our speakers to come up. We have three incredible people to have a conversation with tonight. We've got Cecile Bester from Environmental Justice Australia, which is the environmental law NGO here in Victoria, doing incredible work holding governments and corporations to account and also fighting for law reform. We have Anasina Gray-Barberio, who runs an organisation called Engage Pasefika. Anasina has Samoan heritage. She's come from the Merribeck branch, but don't hold that against her across the way. But Anasina is an incredible community leader for her community, particularly Pacific Island people who live here in Melbourne, people who are obviously on the front lines of climate change, and she's generously offered to share the experience of her community with us tonight. And then we also have Jessie, I've forgotten your last name, Das. I wasn't sure if it was Bass or Das. Jessie Das, who's a young person who's one of the people who have been calling this week for Victoria to put the right to a safe climate in our Human Rights Charter. And there's been a group of really brave young climate activists. There are a few of them here. I can see Thomas, I can see Sophie. I'm not sure if there are any others here, but we had an incredible group of young people come to Parliament this week who called on the government to put the right to a safe climate in our Human Rights Charter. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment and how that went and where that call's come from. But Jessie is one of the young people leading that. Also someone who has experienced bushfires and the impacts of climate change and can talk to us a little bit about his experience. So I thought I'd start just by explaining the current political situation a little bit here in Victoria, then I'll pass on to Cecile to talk about what law reform we need. Here in Victoria, we have, I guess, a so-called progressive government, a Labor government, that talks a big game when it comes to climate change. And to give them credit where it's due, has made some good decisions when it comes to climate change. I can see Tim Reid, one of our other MPs, also from the Merribeck branch. come across the way. Thanks, Tim, for joining us. Merribeck branch, not a good. This is a guard for the Darebin branch. So we have a Labor government that talks a big game when it comes to climate change. And to be fair, they have made some decent decisions, under pressure from the Greens, mind you. I was first elected 10 years ago in the Victorian Parliament when we didn't really have any climate targets, we didn't really have any renewable energy targets, and we had a Liberal government with an incoming Labor government that was about to win, that was hell-bent on building a huge new toll road through our inner suburbs, and who supported opening up Victoria to toxic gas fracking. And the Greens were campaigning to say, stop the toll road, we don't need thousands more cars on our roads. Ban gas fracking, we don't need gas fracking destroying our farmland and destroying our water and destroying our climate. And let's have some renewable energy targets. And of course the community were calling for these things too. This wasn't the Greens in isolation. And we had huge community campaigns against fracking and against the toll road. And we had a government that said, no, we're going to build it, we're going to honour the contracts, until the pressure got so big from the community that they ended up, right before the election, saying that they would rip up the toll road contracts and not build that toll road, and that toll road never got built. We also had that government, when they come in, face a huge community campaign, particularly from regional Victorians, saying, we do not want gas fracking on our land. A campaign that went for a number of years. Friends of the Earth was an NGO that was really involved in that, getting unlikely people together. I did a tour across Victoria with a beef farmer from New South Wales, something that I thought I would never do in my career. Bringing unlikely allies together to say, environmentalists and farmers, to say, no, we don't want gas fracking. And that community campaign got so big that eventually the government saw that and said, actually, this is so unpopular, we're going to ban it. Not only ban it, but put that ban in the Constitution of Victoria so that it was even more permanent. And we had a government that say we can't have renewable energy targets because that's a federal government matter, and the Victorian government cannot override the federal government. It's not a matter for us, until we had experts and academics and the Greens pushing and saying we can have them in Victoria, and now we do have them. And not only do we have them, they've been ratcheted up in the last couple of years. So we've got some really good things happening here in Victoria. At the same time, we all know in this room that it's not nearly enough. And we need to do so much more when we're seeing the floods that hit us, the fires that hit us, the extreme weather that we're facing, and the fact that we've probably breached 1.5 degrees already. And so we're here tonight to have a talk about what more do we need to do in terms of law reform here in Victoria, and what are some of the opportunities and avenues we could use to push the government to go further on what needs to change here in Victoria. I've got some ideas, but I think these wonderful people have some even better ideas. So I might hand over to you, Cecile, to have a talk about what you think needs to change here in Victoria.
Hi everyone. Well, I've got my notes like a typical paper pushing lawyer, I'm sorry. But I brought the bill with me just to make sure that I sort of can stay close to what it's promising. And what I want to, I suppose law reform is a big topic, especially in environmental law and environmental justice, but keeping it more kind of confined to this bill and what it does, which is adding a new right to a safe climate into the Vic Charter, that's what it proposes to do. It's sort of like, why is that a useful area to reform? And I think one of the things that it does is it helps to make, one of the problems that we have with climate change is that it's a disparate and global problem, and governments don't tend to see it as part of their short-term and more local decision-making. And implementing a right in this way makes those short-term decisions, it sort of ties them to their longer-term consequences. And in that sense, this bill picks up what another bill tried to do at the federal level, which you might have heard about. There was an intergenerational kind of duty of care bill that was unfortunately rejected by the Senate quite recently, and that aimed to do a similar thing. This all kind of comes off the back of some work that was done by Anjali Sharma and a bunch of young activists who brought litigation trying to argue that the Environment Minister, when considering whether to approve new projects, whether she had to take into account the greenhouse gas emissions of those projects and the impact that they have on young people's right to like a safe and healthy future. And unfortunately, in the Sharma litigation, that proposed duty was rejected. But the court, in doing that, said this isn't a matter for the courts. This is a matter for policymakers and for legislators. And so, what this bill aims to do, it picks up that challenge and says, all right, here's some legislation that we could do to pick up that and draft it for ourselves. So yeah, I think in that sense it's like a helpful reform in that it takes a suggestion from the court and it implements it as like, this is one way that we could try to make the harms that are happening further down the track part of the the calculus of what decision makers have to take into account today. Because part of this sort of intergenerational equality piece is that a lot of the decisions that are being made today, the people who are making them won't live to see the consequences. So forcing them to consider that is one way to prevent, for example, massive expansions of fossil fuel projects, approving new resource extraction, and other things. And I don't want to just rabbit on, but yeah, I'll talk more about like interconnectedness of different decisions. And the other thing that's helpful about this bill is that it's not just saying that the Environment Minister has to consider things in a certain way when approving, say, fossil fuel projects, it's something that might affect decision makers in other capacities because, as we now know, climate change isn't just something that arises when you're the Environment Minister considering certain projects. It's a consideration that you should take into account in a broader range of contexts, like transport, health, housing, like it affects everything. And so it's important to start kind of considering it from that point of view as like a total system problem, not just an environmental problem.
Thank you. So I might go to you, Anasina, now, just to talk to us a little bit about what kind of impacts your community is facing and what they're telling you about how they feel about climate change.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. My name is Anasina. I am a daughter of Samoan parents. Samoa is a small island in the Pacific region, and currently the harmful impacts of climate change are already happening, and they're happening through things like the marine environment, the dying of reefs, ocean acidification, which is having direct impact into families' livelihoods, economic prospects. And that's just Samoa. And guess what? We're the lucky ones, because believe it or not, our other Pacific neighbours like Tuvalu, for example, as of last year became the first digital nation to safeguard their own culture and sovereignty. And at the United Nations Declaration Statement, Article 13, there's a statement that says there, every person should have a right to return to their country. But how can this be when countries like our Pacific neighbours and brothers and sisters are going to be submerged? There is no question about that. The hazard of climate change is here right now. And even though I live in this beautiful state that we call Victoria, I have a deep connection to my ancestral lands, and that is tied into my work as a community leader with Engage Pasefika. I always have that environmental activist lens when I'm working with organisations and stakeholders, asking them, what is your footprint when it comes to climate responsibility? We have to be courageous in calling out what is, I guess you spoke to Cecile about equality. Pacific regions, they contribute near to nothing to the emission and yet are suffering quite hard. So yeah, it's a pretty emotional topic for me, but I feel like to be given space tonight to offer a Pacific Island perspective is also affirming what we're doing, the Koreans are doing tonight, in standing with young people and affirming the next generation when it comes to ensuring that, you know, their vulnerability to have a say in climate legislation continues to be amplified and elevated. Thanks, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Anasina. What about you, Jessie, as a young person who's part of the call to put the right to a safe climate in our Human Rights Charter in Victoria? Tell us a little bit about why you think that that's important and the kinds of things you're seeing when it comes to young people and concern for climate change.
Well, firstly, I'm just blown away with what was mentioned previously. I think the both speakers here are amazing. So, let's turn on.
Anyway,
you can just just a little bit about myself. I'm an ecology student. I'm an ecology major, and part of ecology is knowing that the interactions between species and the environment. And one thing I learnt from my degree was that everything is interconnected. And actually, just part of my preparation for today, I actually made a little mind map here about what's a right to a safe climate. And I looked at different things. It's health. It is asthma. It's smoke. It's my little brother actually has asthma, and during the fires and all that, he had trouble breathing. There are times in summer when my brother and my mum can't even leave the house. And so climate is health, right? Climate's migration, as mentioned. Tuvalu, people moving, climate refugees, people leaving their houses. That's part of a safe climate. That's then also both of them actually relate to economics. You need to fund, healthcare. You need to fund migration. You've got agriculture. This is also an area that I've studied about how there's actually reduced yields of agricultural production from greenhouse gas emissions. For example, I actually wrote an article about the effects of climate change on wheat in Australia, and how actually even I'm not sure if anyone bakes bread here, but protein in wheat is really important, and actually the combination of increased temperatures and greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide in particular, actually reduces the amount of protein in wheat, right? And that actually affects the nutritional value, which then in turn affects health, and then also affects the economy. So anyway, going back to how it affects young people, I think young people are at the forefront of it. They're, as mentioned before, young people we'll be facing this throughout our lives. A lot of people are not sure what the future's going to look like when I'm elderly. I don't know if this world will be even remotely recognisable.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And one of the things that we looked into when we looked at this Sharma case where all of this started, which was Anjali Sharma versus the Environment Minister saying the Environment Minister should have a duty to consider young people's future when making decisions about things like coal mines. When we looked at it, and then there was the legislation Independent Senator David Pocock put up in the federal parliament, which unfortunately the Senate has struck down. We thought, okay, well, let's bring this to Victoria then. What could we do if they're not going to do it federally? Could we do it here in Victoria and in a more progressive place that cares about climate change? And one of the things when we were talking to some barristers was about it would help lawyers then be able to sue essentially the government who makes decisions that aren't in line with the targets that they said they were going to meet, or aren't in line or aren't commensurate or compatible with a safe climate. So I don't know, Cecile, you have any comments about that? I know that the Human Rights Charter doesn't have a lot of teeth, and we can talk about that. We have a barrister here.
Yep.
But why is it useful, beyond just a symbolic thing to say that government should consider it? How is it actually useful to have that in law for the lawyers like yourself who then actually use the law to try and get change?
Yeah, so the Charter, as you may know, in Section 38 of the Charter, there's a requirement on public authorities to act compatibly with the rights set out within the Charter. So this bill would add a new right, which is which includes actions that are reasonable in the circumstances in order to protect the right to a safe climate. So it has that requirement of reasonableness in it, which is a sort of objective test on a certain view. And although the Charter it falls into what you call a kind of dialogue model, so it's not particularly strong, and that's why I think it's often kind of considered toothless. But there are little hooks in there, ledges narrow enough that you could stand on, that you could try to challenge decisions that fall outside the scope of what's reasonable in the circumstances. So what I want to say, though, is a couple of things. One is that this idea of states sometimes making small adjustments that can happen kind of at a faster pace than the federal progress can be really helpful. And I just want to illuminate that by reference to a couple of examples in the US that we've seen recently. So a few US states in their constitutions in about the 1970s enacted rights to a clean, healthy environment. And for decades, these kind of lay dormant, and it was thought that nothing would really ever be able to be done with them. And then in recent years, we've seen a real resurgence of these kind of creative legal arguments coming out. There was a case in Montana last year where a group of 16 young people challenged the way that their state approved reviewed fossil fuel licenses, and they were successful. And there's been a case in Hawaii where also young plaintiffs just a few weeks ago reached a settlement with their government based on a similar right in the Constitution. So the idea that sometimes these smaller state-based rights might not seem they might seem to be toothless, or they might seem to be more of a kind of soft law, but they have the capacity in the right circumstances to give rise to really quite exciting cases, and they can really give lead to good legal change. And the other thing is that it might not every law has to be a hook for litigation. Laws can also just like nudge governments into trying to actually act in accordance with what people want. And I think that as environmental lawyers and anyone who's an environmental activist, you're often sort of accused as being this like, it's like lawfare and it's against it's delay, it's holding up progress. But everyone wants a safe and healthy environment. There's no reason why governments can't just make decisions in accordance with that in a way that makes it better for everyone. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I often think about laws, I like what you said there about, laws don't necessarily have to have all these kind of really sharp teeth, I guess, in order to be effective. They can be signals, they can be signs, they can lay dormant and then become useful. And we've seen that a lot in Victoria as well. I mentioned before the situation of fracking being put into the Constitution. I mean, that doesn't really mean anything, right? It's a bit of a stunt. It was a way for the government to get up and say, no, we're really serious about banning fracking, let's put it in the Constitution. But not a bad thing to have a media cycle where the government gets to talk about why banning fracking is bad. That's a good thing. And then also now it needs a higher threshold to repeal that ban if a future Liberal government or Conservative government gets in and they want to overturn the ban on fracking. There's just a slightly higher threshold in order for them to overturn it. So I think there's some real validity to that argument that laws don't necessarily, even if it doesn't look like they have much teeth, they can be used and they can be used creatively. And I think we saw that this week with the young people coming to Parliament. We did a press conference and these two young people spoke very impressively about why it was important to have a safe climate. And then we get media attention on that and the government hears that and, it all adds up to this story about young people demanding more from their governments. I'm going to take us on a slight tangent here now, but ask Anasina about something I know she knows about, which is, we're talking about young people who perhaps don't always have much of a voice, who can't vote if they're under 18, coming and trying to affect change on a bigger stage. And I want to talk about that in relation to Pacific Islands as well. I know that you know about the Marshall Islands and the impact that they've been able to have on the international stage. Can you tell us a bit about that to have an outsized impact on the global stage?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if a lot of you know about the Marshall Islands. They're a bunch of low-lying islands in the Pacific with a population of approximately 59,000 people. So that would be equivalent to the population of Northcote and Brunswick. I checked that. And basically what they did at the last Paris Agreement, very small nation, but with tenacity and heart, they were able to get the endorsement of developed nations to come on board on what they called the Higher Ambition Coalition. And essentially what this achieved was pushing for global recognition of what Alan referred to as 1.5 degree global warming, to not exceed that. Although with the way things are going, that could be a possibility sooner than we would like to, we're ready for. But basically what that shows with the Marshall Islands is that the activism that they've been doing for such a long time, since the early 1980s. And for a small population where there is saltwater intrusion right now that is impacting their access to clean water, food security, the impacts on the change in the soil for them to grow their food. What they were able to achieve at Paris Agreement just shows you the power, like it is tonight, of solidarity and collective voices when we're trying to achieve the same goal of stronger climate legislation and stronger climate targets, and recognizing that there are a lot of voices that are vulnerable right now but are not often given that opportunity to be elevated. And I'd like to use the privilege that I have this evening to be able to give space to them that, yes, they're from the Pacific, but there's quite a few Marshall Islands people here in Victoria as well. Very small, but they are here. And I think, in the context of Victoria, people are being forced to leave what they know, their homes, due to, as we've already said, natural disasters. But in the Pacific region, that's on a bigger scale, with no say at all with regards to their future. So, I take inspiration from our Marshallese colleagues and brothers and sisters about what it takes to stand firm with your values when it comes to climate emergency and the fight for survival. It's real.
Thank you. And then bringing us back to young people here in Victoria, Jessie, tell us about the climate activism that you've been engaged in, and I know a lot of young people have been involved in the climate strikes. And how are you feeling? Do you feel like governments are responding to that? Do you feel let down? Do you feel hopeful? What's the mood of young people when it comes to climate and their activism at the moment?
Okay, I don't think this is working. Depends on what you don't do much. Okay, I do want to give credit where credit's due. I think there is in legislation goals at the moment for Victoria. I think there is I can't remember the exact statistic, but how the set amount of renewable energy by this year. But I don't think it's happening fast enough. And actually, I think I did I had the statistic out, but we're actually on a trajectory for 2 degrees warming, and that's and also as a country that I think we're producing more greenhouse gas emissions above our weight. We're actually there was a statistic that I just did some research this morning, and how if you actually incorporate for example we're actually the second largest coal exporter in the world, and if you incorporate that, we're actually the 6th largest greenhouse gas emitter. So we actually I think as a young person we've still got a lot to go. We've got we need to I think we've got things happening at the moment, but it needs to happen a lot faster, and I think we do need measures in place to make sure people are held accountable. Yeah.
Thanks. And I'll bring these two remarkable young people into the conversation as well. Thomas, I'd like to hear from you first about your activism and how you feel young people are feeling after the incredible climate strikes that young people led a couple of years ago. How are young people feeling now?
Thank you so much, Ellen. This was something I reflected on during the press conference as well. It feels really disappointing that we organised the second largest protest in Melbourne's history. There were 200,000 people out in the streets. People had finished the entire lap before I was even able to leave Treasury Gardens. And it didn't seem to measure any response from the major parties and from the establishment parliament. So I think a lot of young people have suffered a lot of burnout because they feel that even our biggest thing, the thing that we put all the effort into, it just didn't seem to manifest. But on the other side of that, there's a lot of burnout and there's a lot of disappointment, there's a lot of anger. There is this really big now desire for hope, but a hope that isn't even just about this small area, but it's about kind of building a really comprehensive vision. To reference Jessie's discussion of everything's interconnected, the longer that the establishment tries to kind of hold the tide, the more passionate young people are about a bigger, more holistic vision.
Yeah, amazing. What about you, Sophie?
I think that, like you said, I think it's sort of confusing, when you're in the thick of the protest, you're around everyone that's shouting the same message as you, and it feels how is this, it feels isn't this what everyone thinks? And then you go back to school and to everything else, and this sense of urgency that you think everyone is feeling, it's just not there. It's just yeah, we can think about this later on. And I think it's true, without sounding too cynical and pessimistic, it just feels so hopeless and disappointing that this much effort and such a key issue on my mind all the time can just be dismissed so frequently. So I think, this is such a glimmer of hope to have the Greens doing this, but yeah, it's disappointing that this is something like this has to happen. Like, it should be an assumed duty of care, and it shouldn't have to be legislated for, like, this should be something that's already happening.
You'll see it in the ballot books eventually.
Yeah.
Well, just the thing I just want to bring up is that like I feel like I'm a bit older, the older range of young people, but like I have noticed since a kid, like, you know, in the earlier 2000s, there was climate change denial. People for decades you just denied that climate change was real. It was an inconvenient truth. It was unprofitable, and then now I've actually noticed the narrative's now shifting. It's no longer denial because you can't deny it anymore, despite statistics and despite the data. It's now gone to, oh well, it's happening. We have no way to stop it. There's no nuance about like the idea of, well, if your house is burning, what are you gonna save? You don't just let the entire house burn. You take the most important things. If we can find a way, we can sure, we are on trajectory for like 2 degrees warming, but we can choose how much warming we go. It doesn't have to be all bad. We can prevent the most disastrous scenario. And the fact that like there isn't, like that kind of argument isn't taken seriously is disappointing. Yeah.
And I think Pacific Islanders, like you talked about, Anasina, almost thinking like that, aren't they? Talk to us about, you were telling me the other day about certain nations like buying land in Australia. Talk to us about that and how Pacific Islanders are trying to protect like sovereignty and culture in a scenario that seems pretty bad.
I'll just hold it.
Metaphorical, let's say.
Yeah, the last Pacific Forum, which was held, the last one, there is one that just finished, but back in 2019 there was a Pacific Forum which involved Pacific Island nations as well as Australia in those conversations, recommitting themselves to the Pacific Island when it came to climate catastrophe and disaster. And as part of those agreements, as a developed nation, they were more concerned with resettling vulnerable climate migrants than they were in reducing emissions. And as Pacific Island nations, those are tensions that we're constantly having to navigate. So in Queensland, there is land that's been allocated for islands like the Kiribati, but that doesn't mean that people from the Kiribati are like, yeah, take me, I'm happy to get on that plane. No, they want to stay in the Kiribati. They don't have a choice. Like, they're at that precipice right now where, what do they do with their culture and their sense of place when it's so interconnected with climate change? So that is on the cusp of happening, but we can't, we don't have a choice to lay down on the ground. We've got to keep fighting and continue that persistence for reduction of emissions and really putting pressure, like Ellen said, on current governments, constantly going around in circles to build consensus. Meanwhile, climate change continues to worsen. So, yeah, definitely need to put that spotlight on ruling governments that have that power to affect change and climate impacts.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll go to the crowd now. Any questions, any comments? I'm looking at you, Thibaut, because I know you have some.
Sure. Look, I mean, I'm all about soft law, but it's not taking us where we need to go fast enough, right? And I love, obviously, that initiative with the bill. I've tried to find the text, I couldn't, so I'd love to read it carefully. But I think, does it read safe climate? Is that the wording? Safe climate?
Yeah.
Or?
Every person has the right to a safe climate, having regard to the risks to life, health and property arising due to climate change. And then subsection 2 is the right to a safe climate includes protection from the risks of climate change through actions which are reasonable in all the circumstances.
Right. So what I think we should also consider doing is increasing or protecting the charter, making it because at the moment it's just another act, so requiring a special majority to change it. So you could alter some section 18 of the Constitution Act but you need a special majority to change the section. But I think increasing its status to something attached to the Constitution, maybe making it a schedule to the Constitution Act. Anyway, it sounds very technical. I'm sorry, I'm just a lawyer. But and also removing the possibility to override rights, because I think we need to think of a mechanism, a legal mechanism, so that laws and executive decisions that are incompatible with the rights are simply invalid. And I think it's fine to include a duty to consider, a relevant consideration being future generations and the right to save climate. But what's going to get you if the minister hasn't considered it? All you're going to get is a mandamus asking for the decision maker to reconsider it. The decision needs to be made invalid. It's really powerful to hear the perspective of Pasefika landers. It's urgent. We're okay. Countries are disappearing. We don't have time, and it's on us to act. Anyway, so it was great to hear that. It's just I sometimes I forget as well, but I get also quite emotional just to actually realise that countries are disappearing, and it's happening now, and so just like so yes, a few ideas, but maybe just finding a way to make laws and decisions invalid if they're incompatible with certain things in the Charter.
Yeah, that's a good point, and something that we didn't really explain at the start, but you've reminded me, Thibault, is what the Human Rights Charter is actually for in Victoria. So it's not necessarily a binding act, and Cecile will correct me when if I get any of this wrong, but essentially we are the only state that has this kind of mechanism, as far as I know, I think, where we have a Human Rights Charter, and we don't have a Bill of Rights.
Queensland does have a Human Rights Act.
Oh, there we go, Queensland. Did we have ours first? Is that why?
The ACT was the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know
Great.
that.
I mean, Queensland didn't stop them from jailing Shelby anyway.
That's right. And so we don't have a Bill of Rights in this country, I guess is the point, right? We don't have a Bill of Rights that is binding.
Yeah.
And so states have tried to get around that by having these human rights charters. But in Victoria, it is, I guess, soft law in a way. It puts some requirements on government. It means that every law has to go to a certain committee of parliament, which MPs sit on, and they have to look at each law, and they have to report against whether it actually breaches any of the rights in the Act, and they have to bring a report to parliament. So it's a small hurdle, very small hurdle, but it's a hurdle.
Yeah.
And you know, the government kind of has this soft obligation not to do things that breach the Human Rights Charter, and there are, you know, there can be some consequences, but they can justify why they need to break the Human Rights Charter. And we saw that recently with when people were locked up in the public housing towers as part of COVID. And that was taking away their freedom and liberty, which is something that's in the Human Rights Charter. And that was challenged, and essentially the government said, well, it was exceptional circumstances, we had the right to detain people in that way.
Yeah.
No, even though it didn't happen to anyone else apart from public housing towers. Then Thibault's right in the way that it's a bit soft, and some of those little hurdles that you have to go across are small and you can jump them fairly easily, but it does put these barriers in the court of public opinion, where that was challenged, the public housing towers lockdown. You do have to bring a report to Parliament. You do have to say, if you're going to breach one of those laws, why, and that is public information. It's not something that can just be hidden away by government and put under the rug. It's publicly available information. So if they do something that's really egregious, there's a spotlight put on it, and the Greens can put a spotlight on it, the media can put a spotlight on it. These are all tools that we need to use in the fight against climate change. But I take your point around the Constitution, where if something is put in the Victorian Constitution, you don't need a referendum to overturn it, but you need a special majority of Parliament. So you need, is it?
3/5.
3/5, yeah. 3/5, I should know that, I'm in the Parliament, but 3/5 of the members rather than just a simple majority, half, to overturn those laws, which is why they've put fracking in the Constitution. So that could be a good next step. I think the first step we're going to get over is the government actually supporting putting a safe climate in the Human Rights Charter, which we haven't got to yet.
Yeah. There's a thin end of the wedge argument too. The more incremental gains, or the smaller gains you can make, the more you shift the overton window so that you're more likely to get some traction with these. But I take your point. It's urgent. I mean, honestly, law reform's too slow. We should have acted yesterday.
We don't have that much time.
Yeah, but that's what the law is. The law is slow.
Yeah.
And that's another, I mean, the law is like this big, slow moving beast that's also like very hard and inaccessible and elitist. But then, like, if you can use that to your advantage, like the slow grind of the law can be a useful tool, because once that big momentum starts to move, it's got a lot of momentum and it's hard to stop. That, you know, that inertia operates in the other way. And I mean, like, with, you know, judicial review, yeah, what, you get an order of mandamus and you come back and the minister remakes the decision. Having said that, we've been in this Living Wonders litigation, we've held up 11 major coal mines for 2 years. Like, you know, it's slow, it can be really useful to do that, like, yeah.
And maybe we should talk about forestry legislation in that
No more native
vein,
forest
because we've been fighting against logging ever since, like, it was the first thing that I became an activist for when I was like 19, locking on in East Gippsland's forest. Like, that's where I became an activist. And I thought, oh, this is so bad. This will be done by quick smart. Like, oh, we got one state election. Surely this will be over. And I went and handed out leaflets for Richard Di Natale, who was running for the Greens in Melbourne. And I was like, this will be done quick smart. Oh no, 10, 15 years later. And the thing that actually stopped forestry was a combination of things, right? Native forest logging in Victoria. It was election campaigning and just chipping away at the social licence of native forest logging. It was people going out to the forest and locking on and just delaying and causing headaches for the loggers and causing headaches for the government. But then it was strategic litigation is what it got over the line as well. And that's because initially, because of all those headaches that the activists and the Greens were able to create, the government felt like they had to put some laws in place. And they were tiny little laws, like these were tiny little hurdles. And at the time we thought it wasn't good enough, right? It was just, oh, there'll be a forestry code of practice and there'll be just some small regulations over here that the foresters can easily meet. But they felt they had to do that because of the public pressure and because of the social licence. And then they sat there for ages and we didn't really do anything with them. And we thought, oh, this is a waste of time. There's all these laws, and the government kept saying, oh, there's all these laws and regulations, and they're all meeting them. It's all totally fine. And so I got really disheartened. But then, after a few years, really smart lawyers were able to find cases where they go, oh, that logging coup is like the worst one that's actually killing an endangered species and they haven't done the right, checks and balances according to these technical laws. Great, we'll take that one to court. And then, oh, there's another one over there, and there's another, and then they just kept holding them up. And eventually, the forestry industry, the loggers just lost so much money, which then was more of a bad news story. And it just became this huge headache for the government, and the government just said, right, that's it, we've got to end it. I don't know if you have anything more you want to add on that, Cecile.
Spot on.
Other questions and comments?
Can I just ask a question? Because in relation to what you're saying there, Alan, like, the kids are saying, like, it's not moving fast enough, like, it's not happening quickly enough. And then we're saying, well, yeah, but the law moves slow and that's good. But then you're also saying that there's actually a point where we got to where we actually have a bunch of different things happening at the time, and that was kind of the thing that really tipped it over the line. Is there ways that people are thinking about, or creative ideas that we can utilise that almost as a method to speed things up potentially by using, okay, well, how can we have like a group attack on this angle and that angle? It's a question I don't know if there's answers in the room, but I don't know.
I don't think that any one thing's going to solve climate change, I guess, is my simple answer. And I always think of climate change as it's non-linear. Social change is non-linear. So if you have a graph, it doesn't just go like you do one action, you get a bit of social change, you do a bit more, you get a bit of some more social change, and it goes on this linear axis. It goes like this. So it's like you do a lot, you get nothing, you get nothing, you nothing, and then all of a sudden, it just goes exponentially. That's my experience of social change, but I don't know if other people want to talk about it. And to me, that just says you have to do everything. And so even though this one particular intervention that these young people have brought might not have enough teeth, and it might not be the one thing that happens, and we might not even get it passed in the Victorian Parliament, it's just like one more kind of rock adding to the scale, and you just don't know which rock's going to tip the whole thing. But I'd love to hear from our panellists.
No, definitely, I agree. It's, climate change is is so big now. It's no longer just to the Pacific region. You've got the Caribbean, you've got Africa, you've got Bangladesh, you've got the Maldives. It is widespread, the hazardous effects of climate change. So we have to be creative. We have to use culture, storytelling, all these things that culminate to keep it at the forefront, to continuously think about how we disrupt the status quo that says, oh no, we're okay, well, we're a little bit removed. Oh, it's just a flood once in 100 years. How many times are we going to be hearing that? You know, before we know it, it's going to be more than 100 years. It'll be once or twice every year. The Solomon Islands, just really quickly, they're having Solomon Islands, unprecedented natural disasters, and for the first time, they had 2 Category 4 cyclones in the space of 2 days. That's just unheard of for them. These things happen every 5-10 years, but the frequency in which natural disasters are occurring everywhere, as well as here in Victoria, it's already at our doorstep, whether we're ready to accept it. But I'm preaching to the choir here, everyone is on board. I'm talking about out there. So yeah.
Well, even on Solomon Islands, there's I heard bushfires for the first time in the Pacific, in a tropical area. You know, you usually need dry, hot conditions. This is in that area like Solomon Islands, 80% humidity. The fact that could happen, you know. Yeah.
I think the narrative point is such a good one. It's telling stories. It's getting that story out there. The fact that it's an existential threat to many places. It's an existential threat to us. And I think picking up on something Jessie said earlier, countering this idea of Australia as a small and non-responsible country, we are consistently in the top 3 of coal and gas emissions, exports and emissions. Our footprint is so outsized. We are highly culpable on the world stage. And every time we talk about our net zero commitments, that's our domestic emissions. We're nowhere near capping or even starting to reduce our exported emissions, and they're the ones we need to worry about. That's how we're contributing to the problem. And I think any ways that we can find to counter that narrative of Australia is on track to meet its goals, those are irrelevant goals. The fact that our own domestic emissions are reducing, great, good, keep doing that, but the elephant in the room is that we are continuing to export huge amounts of greenhouse gas emissions overseas.
It's one third of all coal exports are from Australia.
That's wild.
In the world.
Imagine if we could do something to touch that.
So that's how we actually get rid of responsibility, is that we say, we're only at 1%. We're only 1% of global emissions, so we can't do anything. It's not our responsibility. But it's where's China getting its coal from? Where's India getting its coal from? Japan doesn't have a really good mining sector, actually. So. And actually, when I lived abroad, Japanese people mentioned, we get all our energy comes from Australia, from coastal fuels from Australia.
Yeah.
And
that's it. That's exactly it. Yeah.
But actually, something I want to also mention is that we talked a lot about if it's passed, you can put pressure on politicians and on the government. But I think also we haven't talked about how civilians can even do this for corporations, because people who employ, employees can actually see the insights of what's going on in their workplaces, and see whether companies are actually abiding by this. If it becomes an issue of human rights officially by law, potentially there is potential for legal action against corporations.
Yeah, I think this amendment would be directed to the actions of public authorities, but you're absolutely right that we need to not just focus on holding up government approvals, but also target corporations directly. We all know who the villains are. There's a few, Woodside, Santos, whatever, but targeting corporations is also a really good strategy, I think.
Other comments and questions from the floor? I'll go here and then come back to you, Thomas. Rodney.
Oh, thanks, Ellen. So I guess I'm a field campaigner at heart, and I tend to think about practical effects of things. So if you take the specific kind of greenhouse gas issue in Australia, and one on my mind is whether we use gas generation or pumped hydro storage to back up the electricity grid. So let's suppose the Victorian government wants to approve a bunch of gas generators. What sort of approaches might be used with the Human Rights Act to try to interfere with that?
I have the Greens energy spokesperson up the back here. You might have some insights to share.
I think there's a lot of potential in locally based campaigns. The one that comes to mind, the most urgent one, if you like, is what I like to call the waste to emissions incinerator plan for Lara. So I think we're going to be seeing a number of waste to energy plants built around Victoria, or attempts to build them around Victoria. And whether it's a gas turbine or a new coal plant, or in this case, waste to energy, I think that localised, locality-based, using the neighbours of this project is one potent weapon we have. And I could sense that maybe this human rights, beefing up the Human Rights Charter in this way, adding a right to a safe climate, could be a weapon in that war. I think particularly we've seen, I think waste to energy is something that's a lot of yucky pollution as well, so I think that kind of adds to it. But I'd be really interested to see this being applied in that context.
Gas is the next frontier in the fight in Victoria, really. So we have, speaking to the point about exports, Jessie's point, we have 80% of the gas in Australia gets exported offshore because they can get more money for it. And then the government goes, oh no, maybe we don't have enough gas for our homes, better open up some new gas plants, better drill for some more gas. And we've just had approvals of, where's Chris? Is Chris still here?
Yeah.
How many fields do you remember off the top of your head that it just got approved off the coast of Victoria?
Oh, I think there was
12 or something?
12. And I think there's there's a few different companies, and there's the state waters one, there's the Commonwealth waters one. I think it's 12 all up, but it's the start of a lot more to come as well. There's seismic blasting, which is exploring with sonic bombs dropped in the ocean to approve more gas. So there's different steps. Sorry, my mind goes, when I ask that question, I'm like, oh, they're all in different steps.
It's very complicated.
12 apostles.
But there's gas drilling happening in state waters, which is close to the coast, and then in Commonwealth waters. And I think the right here, if we did get it into the Human Rights Charter, would apply to the Victorian government's approvals for drilling in state waters, which does exist, which they've just opened up one right near the 12 Apostles.
I suppose I have a question around political reform, and maybe a broader question, state, federal, maybe it's a federal issue, but the role or intersection of lobbying and human rights, political lobbying and human rights, and I suppose the question of, is lobbying, where does that fit with human rights? Because it doesn't.
What do you mean in terms of the intersection, and where does it fit?
Well, I suppose we're talking about a right to a safe climate, and some of the language in there, and I'm not a lawyer.
That's all right.
I do food. But I suppose if we're talking about rights to a safe climate, that is almost the antithesis to at the moment in terms of it's a huge barrier to that, and the fact that people can lobby to a public service that is meant to be servicing the people. I suppose, is there a way to make that a breach of human rights? I suppose is my question.
That sounds like a good creative legal argument. I said that as a genuine compliment. I think that's a good idea. Speaking of, at the beginning I said there's so much law reform that could happen. One thing that would be really good is better accountability and transparency, because money that we can't see going into pockets or we don't know where they are is such a big cause of so many social and environmental issues.
To change the social license, people don't know what is happening.
We recently, freedom of information kind of requests are a big thing that you do as your day-to-day work as a lawyer, and we had one with the Environment Department, the Minister's Office, saying, oh, we can't give you this document because that'll affect our relationship with the Minerals Council of Australia. And it's okay, great, so good to know who's friends with who, but we need to have open communication with them, and it's why is that not something that's published? That should be a public thing. But I think that intersection of those secret relationships really do affect the ability of a politician to do their job. I think there's something in that, definitely worth thinking about.
The thing that comes to mind is actually the tobacco lobby. How we had one stage there was people smoked everywhere. There was advertisements. There was myself. I actually lived in Indonesia, and Indonesia there doesn't really have that. You have I remember seeing like on the way to work when I was doing work experience there. Like there was a billboard that said, it was a boxer with a cigarette saying "Winners never quit." Right? We don't see that here in Australia, and that's because we've actually we've got laws in place to stop tobacco lobbying now, and we're not taking their word about what's going on with health. We don't take a study by a tobacco company about does smoking actually affect human lungs seriously. And so I think if we can I don't really have much of a law background, but if we can replicate something similar to that with mining, or people who clearly have a conflict of interest, an economic conflict of interest in research or in policy,
I think it's such a great point.
Yeah.
And that was an area where the government was willing to be a leader in terms of reform in health and plain packaging legislation and banning smoking and stuff or banning advertising for cigarettes. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of these companies, like you say, have become something that governments would not want to have an open relationship with. If they said, "Oh, sorry, we need to protect our relationship with Philip Morris, the tobacco company," it just would not fly, right?
Yeah.
And so we need to make Woodside and Santos and the Minerals Council feel that same loss of social license.
Yeah.
And I think we're getting there. I really think that we're getting there. I think 10 years ago, maybe a lot of people wouldn't know what Woodside or Santos were. They wouldn't know their names. They would have flown under the radar. And I think we're getting there. So I have hope. I think that it's a hard road, and it's really devastating and a hard emotional thing for so many of us to carry who've been climate activists for a long time, or people who are directly affected, to have to look for where the hope is. But I think that's all we can do. And I don't know if anyone's read Bob Brown's book Optimism, but his whole contention is that you have no choice but to be optimistic and hopeful, and you have no choice but to act. So just get over it. Get over it. If you're sad about climate change, too bad. You've got to get over it. Because you've got to get on with it. Exactly. And actually we have a responsibility to do it. And I think we've heard that tonight, that not just for us, not just for the young people that are in the room that will be here after many of us are not, but also for people who are in the Pacific Islands, who are our neighbours and who are at the absolute forefront of this. We have a responsibility to do everything that we can. So I want to end on that note and say thank you all for coming out on such a chilly evening, and especially thank you to our three speakers, Cecile, Jessie and Anasina, and to Chris for helping organise that. And also, of course, to Black Spark and Opal for letting us have this incredible space. It is such a beautiful, homely space. And these, I understand, are origami made by local children for the children of Gaza. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, this incredible work of art, and acknowledge what's the lives of the young people in Gaza who are affected by war, but also affected by famine and the wide-ranging impacts that climate change will have on conflict as well. So thank you all for being here, and keep up the pressure, and we'll keep it up alongside you. There's QR codes. Sorry, I should actually say what you can do. There are QR codes on these leaflets here if you'd like to sign our open letter to the government to say that you do want the right to a safe climate put in the Human Rights Charter. If you want to write and say it's got to go in the Constitution, feel free. It's just one thing that you can do, and there is a lot of other things that you can do right now. There are so many organisations. We mentioned 350. There's the EJA, the incredible lawyers who are doing so much advocacy. There's a lot of local council campaigns going on at the moment to try and get good local climate champions onto council. So there's so much that you can do if you want to have an outlet for your frustration when it comes to climate change. And feel free to take some bags and some stickers up at the back as well. Thanks for being here.